If you enjoy hearing these eerie tales and want more to help you drift off or keep you up at night, don't forget to tap the like button. It really helps the channel grow. I don't think my wife is asleep. 2:49 a.m. I lie awake in bed laying on my right side. My wife is behind me. She's awake, I can tell. I can feel her staring at me from behind. She's always been a night owl, but tonight feels different. She feels wrong. She's breathing heavy. I should check on her, but for the life of me, I cannot bring myself to turn around. 3:03 a.m. I can feel her moving closer to me. She moves ever so slightly, and I can feel her touch the back of my hair. Is she caressing me? The hairs on my neck are standing up. Why is her hand so cold? I can see the door to my room through the darkness. My entire body just wants to jump up and run to it. I can't do that. I'm being silly. 3:13 a.m. She's right behind me. I can smell her breath. It's horrible. I've never smelled her like this before. I can feel something pressing into my back. Is it a knife? It doesn't feel sharp. I gotta do something. I decide to jump up and turn the light on, but right before I do, the hall light turns on. I can hear my wife coming up the stairs. She's on the phone with her mom. I can hear her crying. Apparently her grandpa died earlier today. He never liked me. Maybe that's why he decided to pay me a visit tonight. What's a weird or unexplained experience you had while in the hospital? Back in August of 2020, I woke up one morning and passed out and threw up blood all over the place. I was rushed to the hospital where I then learned that I was very close to dying because I had a massive stomach ulcer and I was bleeding extremely bad. My stomach had filled up with blood. While at the hospital, before being rushed into emergency surgery, I was terrified. I didn't know if I was going to make it. And this woman came into my room. She looked at me and asked me, "Are you doing okay?" I said, "Yeah." She then asked me, "Are you scared?" I said, "Yes. I am not religious at all." But she asked if she could pray for me. And I was so worried about not seeing my kids again that I said, "Yes, please, I don't remember the prayer." But I remember she finished and told me everything is going to be okay, and that she'd see me later. She left, and I never saw her after that again. I was in that hospital for 17 days. Then I thought about it. I realized she wasn't dressed like the nurses or any other staff. She wore all black, and it has me wondering who or what was she. I had not been given any pain medicine or anything yet, so it was not a hallucination. I've been thinking about it for 3 years now, and I need answers. Found on an iPhone search history. Hey Siri, show me funny videos. I'm bored and grounded. Hey Siri, show me funny videos. Hey Siri, show me funny TikToks. Hey Siri, show me videos of people falling and it's funny. Hey Siri, show me videos of people getting hurt. Hey Siri, where can I find someone to hurt my parents? Hey Siri, what is the best way to hurt someone? Hey Siri, where can I buy a hammer? Officer Miller sighed heavily. The dead bodies in front of him must have been Mr. and Mrs. Stevenson, although with the decay, it could have been anyone. Neighbors had called police about a terrible stench coming from the apartment. He was no detective, but it looked like the young son who was still missing may have been involved, and it broke his heart. He knew this family, and while the Stevensons could be tough on their son, they loved him. The officer went for his radio to call it in when he felt a blow to the back of his head. His vision started to go dark as he heard, "Hey Siri, what's the best way to get rid of 3 bodies? Never sleep in your car on a road trip. I'm from Connecticut. I was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from Georgia and would often make road trips down to visit her. I don't really mind. I love road trips. I've driven across the United States and back, all on my own. There's just something about traveling the highways of the US by yourself that's just so freeing. To save money, I would sleep in my car. It's not so bad. It's basically camping in a metal tent. Makes you feel like you're really roughing it. I just recline the seat back, keep the key in the ignition just in case, and doze off. No, I don't put anything up to block the windows for privacy. Maybe I should have. The trip down south is a comfortable 2-day drive. My stop would usually be somewhere along the Virginia-North Carolina border. So for my previous trip, that's exactly where I stopped that night. Rest stops were often less trafficked and thus quieter than truck stops. Normally, I would have stopped at a Love's, but I was so tired that I settled for the first rest stop I saw. It was oddly vacant that night, with only a couple lone cars sitting forlorn under the amber street lamps, most likely travelers with the same idea as myself. I pulled into a parking spot away from the others, under the shadow of a tree and far from the street lamps. I figured I would have more privacy there as opposed to being bathed in light. So, I did my usual thing, locked my doors, opened the window just a hair for ventilation, kept my key in, reclined the seat, and went to sleep. I was never interrupted on any of these car camping nights, so I never suspected anything on this one. Then a sharp tap woke me up. At first, I thought I had heard it in my dream. I opened my eyes, a bit confused. Since I was leaned back, I was facing the ceiling and couldn't see anything. I hear another tap, like a tiny object hitting a hard surface. It came in an irregular rhythm. Was it raining? Was water dripping onto my windshield? I'm under a tree. Maybe something fell from the branches. Maybe a squirrel or a bird was dropped something. What if a squirrel was climbing around my car? Or what if it wasn't an animal? The thought occurred to me that it might very well be a person poking around outside. What did they want? Were the doors locked? Yes. The keys were in the ignition. I can leave in an instant. Still, I lay there, completely still, pretending to be asleep, pretending I hadn't heard anything, hoping whoever it was, they would leave me alone. It was better to not find out. I was too afraid to find out. It was better to stay here in blissful ignorance. Still, the tapping continued. I had to do something. There was no way I was just going to stay there. I had to look. My heart was pounding. In that moment, it was deafeningly loud. Whoever was out there could probably hear it. I decided I was going to look. I was going to raise my head up and see what was making the noise. So that's what I did. What met my eyes sent a jolt through entire body. Every muscle fiber locked up in pure shock at what I saw. The faint glow of the street lamps cast just enough light for me to make out what I was looking at. There in the windshield, staring directly at me, was a face. Someone, I presumed to be a woman, was lying on my hood, her face pressed right up against my windshield. Her face was completely still, locked in a permanent grin. I froze in overwhelming terror. The eyes I stared into appeared to have rolled back, showing only the whites. The nose was turned up, pressed painfully into the glass. The lips stretched wide, revealing horrid rotten teeth. Even in the darkness, I could tell her skin was sickly pale, contrasting her long, filthy black hair. Whoever this was, she was clearly not in her right mind. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move. Finally, I got a grip on myself and shot my hand to the ignition. It turned over, making in that instant the most beautiful sound I ever heard. For a split second, I was afraid I might be caught in a horror movie scenario, the one where the car won't crank as the killer approaches. I reversed as fast as I could, trying not to give this creeper time to try anything. In my panic, I remember activating the windshield wipers in a futile attempt to get her off. I thought, was I about to drive out of here with some wacko holding onto my hood? Thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that, because as soon as I stopped, the woman leapt off, landing on all fours. Seeing my opportunity, I shifted into drive and gunned it, right as I saw her reaching for the driver's side door. With my foot on the gas, I sped out of the parking lot. Behind me, I heard her let out a piercing shriek like that of an animal. I looked in my rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw her chasing me, running on all fours, her black hair swinging wildly around her. I couldn't get a good look as I rounded a curve in the road leading out of the rest stop and merged with the highway. There, I picked up speed and drove through the night. I did not dare stop again until I saw the morning light. Job is watching a woman trapped in a room. 3 years ago, I was looking at the local job classifieds online when one of the ads caught my eye. Not because of what it said, but because it said so little. Best I remember, the ad just read job available. Good pay, no benefits. Discretion required. It then listed an email address, and that was all. At the time, I was managing a music store, but I had already started hearing rumors we would be shutting down within the next year, and the likelihood of a transfer to another store was slim. I had been morosely looking at job listings for the last few days, but this was the first one that stood out, if only because I was bored and it was weird. So I sent an email. Half an hour later, I had a response, telling me to go to a particular office building in an upscale part of the city at a precise time for my screening. I went, and after waiting for a few minutes in the lobby, I was taken into an office where I was given a series of forms and questionnaires to fill out. They collected them and told me they would be in touch. I had almost forgotten about the whole thing, until a month later, I got a call saying I had moved on to the second stage of the hiring process. I was again given an address and time, and when I arrived, this time it was a different nice office park 20 miles away from the first one. I was met by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Solomon. He escorted me into a large room that contained a chair and a desk. On the desk were 2 large monitors, a keyboard and mouse, and a bolted-down metal box with 2 oversized buttons on it, one red and one green. He told me this room was a model for the place I would be working if I took the job. He described the job as follows. I would be working 7 shifts of 6 hours every week. My job would be simple. I would arrive at work 10 minutes early and enter an outer area that was like a locker room. I would have my own personal locker. I would store all belongings in the locker and change into the provided work clothes. I was never, under any circumstances, to carry any item of my own into the surveillance room. I was never, under any circumstances, to take any item with me from the surveillance room. As for what I was to do in the surveillance room, I was told that the monitor on the left would constantly show a live stream from a high-definition camera in a remote location. My job was simply to watch the camera. Once an hour, I would get onto the computer attached to the right monitor and enter a brief log describing anything interesting that occurred in the last hour. I would have no pens or pencils or paper, and I should never try to take any kind of written notes about the work. As for the red and green buttons, the red button was only to be used if there was an emergency. This meant something on the video or in my workspace that required outside help. The green button was to be hit if I saw something on the video feed that was particularly noteworthy. It would tell other people somewhere that, at least in my opinion, something interesting was going on. Solomon stressed that while I was given discretion on when to use this button, I should err on the side of only using it if and when something of real significance occurred. He pointed out the camera on the ceiling of the room we were in. He said the real room would be the same. My work would be observed, and other people were watching the room on the video feed as well. He said I was only a redundancy in case other systems failed. He then smirked and asked if I knew what he meant by redundancy. I nodded, trying not to show my irritation. I don't talk that good to people, so sometimes they think I'm dumb. That's okay. Let him think that if he paid me good enough. The pay was very good, $35 an hour. This worried me. I was already thinking this was some kind of psych experiment or secret government job, which I was okay with. But that kind of money to sit and watch a screen? My mom always told me that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is, and this was seeming too good to be true. I asked if I was going to be doing anything illegal. Solomon laughed and said no. I asked if anyone was going to get hurt. Again, he shook his head no. He said the reason they were paying so much was because they needed employees that were motivated to be professional and discreet. The work they were doing was important, and for various reasons it couldn't be discussed. If I took the job, I would have to sign papers promising I would never discuss my work there, or I could be sued or locked up. I'm only breaking that now because of everything that's happened. So I took the job, and because they wanted me to start right away, I had to quit the store with no notice. I felt bad about that, but I was excited about the new job too. It was a lot of money and seemed like easy enough work, if a bit boring. I was nervous that there was something more to it, but I told myself I would just have to see. No point in chickening out and wasting a good chance because I let my imagination go crazy. I was given the location of the job itself, and when I went there, I was amazed that it really was just like the model room I had been shown, with only a few differences. There was a locker room you had to pass through to enter the surveillance room, and there was a small bathroom attached to the real surveillance room also. The real room had a small water cooler in the corner, but because I wasn't allowed to bring anything in with me, I had to eat before or after every shift. The biggest difference, of course, was that the monitors were turned on. The right monitor was just a black and white terminal like you see in movies sometimes. I could type in my logs, but no internet to look at or anything like that. The left monitor, it was video from a room. You would call it a bedroom, I guess, because it had a bed in it, but it had lots of other stuff too. A TV, a sofa and chairs, a couple of tables, and plenty of empty space in between. The camera must be high up in a corner, because I could see pretty much everything except for the far sides of furniture. At first, though, I didn't notice any of that stuff. All I saw was her. She looked to be a little older than me and was very pretty. When I first saw her, she was laying on her side on the sofa. That was the part of the room farthest from the camera, but the picture was very clear, and I could tell that she was sleeping. I found myself leaning into the monitor more so I could see her better, and then I thought about what I was doing and felt embarrassed. It's like I was spying on her. A peeping Tom, my mom used to call it. I didn't want to be a peeping Tom, but I didn't want to be silly either. I needed to think about it slow. It was a good job, and I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? I wasn't hurting anybody. The woman looked fine, and the room was nice. She probably agreed to be there, and it's all some experiment or something. I was just overreacting. So I sat down in the chair and began my work. It didn't take long before I understood more. The woman, I took to calling her Rachel, wasn't there of her free will. I never saw her hurt, but it was clear that she never left that room except to go into what I think is a bathroom area that my camera couldn't see. Well, she never left the room on her own. Periodically, usually a couple of times a week during my shifts, men and women in strange-looking outfits would come in and take her from the room. Sometimes she would struggle, but usually she would just go along with her head hung low. They would always bring her back, though the times when she wasn't brought back during my shift were always the worst for me. I would worry about her until I got to work the next day and saw her in the room watching TV or painting. She never looked hurt or even that upset except for when they took her, and even when she fought, they were always gentle with her. Still, I knew something was wrong. I considered quitting the job, or hitting the red button and getting someone to come so I could get some answers. Or calling the police and showing them what the camera was showing me. Except I was scared. Scared of losing my job, and scared of what these people might do to me if I quit or told on them. Solomon had told me when I took the job that part of being discreet was not asking questions. I would never be asked to do more than I had already been told, but I could never tell anyone what I did or saw, and I could never ask questions about what I was doing or why. So I made excuses. It was all an experiment. She was crazy or sick, and they were trying to help her. She was doing a job just like I was. Or if she really was a prisoner somewhere, at least I was watching to make sure that she was okay. If they ever tried to hurt her, or I saw that she really didn't want to be there for sure, I could get help then. In a way, I told myself, I was helping to protect her by watching. I don't expect you to think much of my excuses. I don't think much of them myself, especially now. But in my defense, when things changed, I didn't ignore it or try to explain it away. I knew something had to be done. Rachel would usually paint for an hour or two every day, and it seemed to always be during my afternoon shifts. The room had no windows as far as I could tell, but I guess she either used a clock or her own body's time to keep to a kind of schedule. I always liked to watch her paint. The thing she was painting was always facing the wrong way for me to see it. but I could see her face as she worked. She always looked peaceful and happy when she was painting, and seeing her that way, smiling serenely from time to time as she got something the way she wanted it, always made my day. I first noticed something was wrong when she started painting more frequently a few weeks ago. Her expression was more focused and serious, and there was a tension to her movements that I wasn't used to seeing. At first, I thought she was just really trying to work hard on something, and I wanted to tell her not to worry. Every few weeks, the others would come in and take the old paintings out anyway, bringing in a new stack of, I think the word is canvas. But it was more than her being focused. Something was wrong. She didn't look happy, and she was going for hours at a time. In the span of 3 days, she had finished 4 paintings. I had been growing more and more worried watching her work, and when she finished the 4th, I found myself telling her to just stop and rest a while. I had grown accustomed to talking to the monitor, talking to her in my own way. But she didn't stop. Instead, she began moving the paintings, arranging them on the back and seat of the long sofa at the far end of the room. This was the first time I had gotten to see any of the paintings. Even when the others were taking them out, they always seemed to be turned away from the camera. I was still worried about her, but I was also happy to finally see something she had worked on. Happy and amazed. They were beautiful. One was a beautiful green forest. Another was an old stone well. A third was a house sitting alone on a small island. The last was an old-fashioned looking movie theater. All of them looked like something out of a dream, with trailing lines of color mixing in the air around them like leaves caught in a wind. It was only when I looked close that I realized the lines of color weren't random. They were words. Easy to miss if you weren't looking close, and by themselves they didn't seem to mean much. Just the ghost of a word somewhere in each of the paintings, easy to lose in everything else that was being shown. I leaned into the monitor and squinted, trying to read the words. Then my heart started thudding as I made them out. Blinking and rubbing my eyes, I looked again, reading them out loud in order, left to right, top pair, then bottom. Please, help me. Thomas. I pushed back from the monitor, my hand over my mouth. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how any of this could be happening. It wasn't just that she was asking for help, though that was a big part of it. Once a year, my parents had me take a blood bath. It was always on the day before my birthday, a tradition I didn't enjoy, but never questioned. My mother would lead me to the tub, my father sitting on the edge, dipping his fingers in to check the temperature for me. I would sit while they washed it into my skin and hair, making sure that I was completely covered before letting me get out. Then I would have to wait as it dried, making my skin feel tight and sticky. I was then sent off to bed with a hug and kiss. On my birthday, the first thing I did was shower off, watching the red retreat down the drain. Then it was like any other birthday. Singing, presents, and cake. It never crossed my mind that our tradition was abnormal. I was excited for my 10th birthday. The prospect of having 2 digits to my age was exhilarating to me. I'd been homeschooled my whole life, but had plenty of friends in my neighborhood to invite to my party. I was asking my friend Jimmy if he was going to be able to come when I caught a glimpse behind the veil. Ah, man, I have to go visit my cousins on Saturday. But maybe I can play with you the day before? He had asked. I thought about it, but knew that my annual bath was due that day. Disappointed, I explained to him why that wouldn't work. Shucks, that's the day I have to take my bath, I told him. Okay, well maybe after that. No, I'll be all sticky. Plus all the blood gets on everything. I could tell by his expression that I had said something wrong. He went running his mouth to everyone, calling me a vampire and upsetting both of our parents, albeit for different reasons. That night I had the first discussion about the bloodbaths with my father. He sat me on the couch and got real serious. Now Ben, today will be the last time you ever talk about the baths you have to take, he stated sternly. He went on to explain that not everything we did was considered normal, and that by keeping it to myself, I was doing us all a favor. After that discussion, I became more curious. It was intriguing to me that not everybody had to take these baths. As I aged into a teen, I started doing what all boys do. I rebelled, and hard. Since I didn't go to school, I tried even harder to fit in when I was around my friends. I smoked, I vandalized, I stole alcohol from my parents. Some of it could be attributed to peer pressure, but a lot of it was my own choices. I wanted a reputation, wanted to be revered as some sort of anarchist. So I kept pushing boundaries, creating a large wedge between my parents and myself. The eve of my 16th birthday, I decided that I would refuse my bloodbath. I was lying on my bed listening to music and reading when my mother came in to tell me they had gotten it ready for me. I knew it was coming, had my response ready. "I'm not taking it," I said, refusing to look up from my book. "Ben, please don't make this difficult. You know you need to," she said, wringing her hands fretfully. I continued to ignore her as she pleaded. After a while, my father came down to see what the delay was. "What's going on?" he asked, appearing in the doorway. My mother told him the situation, his face turning bright red. "Ben, this is happening one way or another," he shouted. I threw my book across the room. "Oh, you think so?" I fired back, instantly bristling to the challenge. His eyes widened and his nostrils flared out. He was more angry than I had ever seen him. "That's right," his voice now becoming a growl. Without a second thought, I charged at him, knocking him aside and running down the stairs. I could hear him screaming at me all the way past the driveway, begging me to return. I ran for a long time, finally running out of breath and resting near a city bus stop. I sat down for a few minutes, aware of a strange sensation at the ends of my fingers. They felt tingly for a bit, then they started to feel hot. Terrified, I watched as they began to blister, running up past my knuckles and cracking open the skin on their way upward. Howling in agony and shocked by what I was seeing, I fell to the ground and writhed. There wasn't a soul around. My cries for help went unanswered as the skin kept on bubbling and cracking, making it all the way up to my elbows. Headlights appeared in front of my eyes. Though I was nearly blind with pain, I recognized my father's car. He leapt out, grabbing me under my armpits and pulling me into the vehicle. I kept screaming during the drive, showing him my disintegrating arms. We drove at a breakneck pace, my father cursing the whole time. His face white, he told me to hold on a little longer, that I would be okay soon. I expected him to take me to a hospital. When we pulled into our driveway, my entire arms and shoulders looked like raw hamburger meat, the skin blistering around my neck and down my sides. It was the most intense agony I had ever been in. My body went into shock. I vaguely recall being carried out of the vehicle, my mother running out to help. We went up the stairs, both of them grunting under my weight. Then blackness took over. Voices around me, swirling distortedly, started to come back into focus. Gradually, the sensation of pain seemed to lighten. My arms were no longer on fire. "He was this close, this fucking close," my father was saying, sounding like he was going to break into sobs. My mother hushed him, telling him he had done a great job, that he had saved me again. I could now feel that I was in a familiar substance, warm, inviting, soothing to my blistered skin. The bloodbath. When they noticed I was awake, they both broke down, telling me how worried they had been, how they could never live without me, that I was their entire world. Their hysterics got me going as well, realizing how awful I had been to them over the last year. They both held onto my hands as I let the blood saturate and heal my mangled skin. The next year I had learned my lesson. My father prepped the tub for me, giving me a half smile as I thanked him after he told me it was ready. I never asked why I had to take them. I never asked where the blood came from. It just seemed like something that we all knew was better off left alone. Which brings me to this year. My father, who is now in his 60s, sat me down again. "Ben, it's time you understand some things." He went on to explain that late in my mother's pregnancy with me, she started having complications. She was on bed rest for a while. barely able to move. She delivered me 2 weeks before her due date, slightly underweight, but very sickly. He explained that he could do little for me, but watch as doctors and nurses did their best to keep me alive throughout the next months. I felt helpless. I begged to trade places with you and take the suffering you were going through from you, he told me, reaching forward and taking my hands. There was this man. I had seen him at the hospital often. He saw what we were going through, our family, and he offered me something. Told me he knew a way to help keep you alive. I didn't want to hear it. I told him to leave me alone, but he persisted. Claimed he was an angel of sorts. As you got sicker and sicker, closer to death's door, he kept telling me he could help. I shook my head. This was a lot to take in, all new information to me. My father continued, tears spilling from his eyes as he went on. Ben, I was desperate. I loved you so much I couldn't lose you. I gave in, asked him to help. I begged, told him whatever he had to do it. He smiled at me, told me he would save you. And just like that, you started to get better. I was shocked, the doctors even more so. We went home. You were healthy. It was a miracle. He wiped his eyes, leaned backward, trying to gather his thoughts, then looked at me. It was just before your first birthday when I saw the man again. It seemed like he had come out of thin air. He said the only way for you to stay alive was to give you your baths each year. I didn't believe him at first, but then we saw what was happening to you, to your skin. It was just like what happened when you were turning 16, only then it was much slower. He spoke shakily. So I did what I had to do. I spilled the blood. I filled the tub. And I have done it each year since. I'm sorry, son. I wish things had gone differently, he finished. I leaned forward and embraced him, having no words for the situation. We stayed like that for a while. Eventually, he broke it off, facing me again. Ben, there's something else. You know that I'm getting older. The time will come, maybe sooner than we think, that I won't be around anymore. He bit his lip, holding in his emotion. Ben, when that happens, you'll have to start filling the tub up yourself. I booked a cabin in the mountains. The previous guests left a strange entry in the guest book I moved to Seattle from Kansas about 5 years ago. I'm one of those tech bros. All you locals are always complaining have ruined your city. Well, I guess it's my city now. Sorry about you. One of my favorite things about the Pacific Northwest is the mountains. I try to get away from the city as often as I can. So when I found this cabin on the Skykomish River, I decided I would treat myself to a midweek getaway in the early fall. I arrived this morning. The cabin was very cozy, tucked away among the trees next to the riverbanks. There was a hot tub on the back deck and Wi-Fi for us tech bros who only like the facade of roughing it. I put my bags on the bed and decided I'd explore inside before I explored out. There was an extensive DVD collection, but mostly romantic comedies and family movies. Magazines from 5 years ago littered the coffee tables. In a little nook in the bedroom, I found a basket containing a few notebooks and local travel guides. The notebooks were, according to the labels, for guest notes. I smirked and laid down with the most recent one. I'd probably get a kick out of this. It was mostly what I expected. People talking about their kids and their dogs and how much they loved the hot tub and the river. Pretty boring. I flipped through the book until I got to the most recent entries. It looked like the last guests had written a few pages. https www.instagram.com Olgugu 10/10/2020 10 p.m. The noises started around 8:30 tonight. At first we thought it was just the rain. We never should have read that book we found in the woods. My eyes widened and I looked more closely at the page. This was a little bit more interesting than the white bread entries before. Well, maybe read is the wrong word. There wasn't enough in any language we understood to actually read. It was nothing but weird symbols and grotesque drawings, except on the very last page, which read in English. when darkness overtakes the day. That's when old Gugu likes to play. Teeth so sharp, eyes so red. Once you see him, you're good as dead. Okay, pretty weird, but whatever. These noises, though, we thought it was dripping rain, but it isn't the right cadence. It sounds more like licking, and every so often there is a crunching sound. Maybe it's just our imaginations. We aren't used to the forest after all. It's so dark and quiet, so every sight or sound seems magnified. As I was closing the curtains in the bedroom, it looked like something was standing at the riverbank. Something vaguely human, but with large horns and big wings folded behind it. My husband says it was a tree. When I looked back, it was gone. Time for bed now. I hope I can sleep. The noises haven't stopped. I chuckled. Clearly someone was getting into the Halloween spirit and having some fun with it. Still, I looked up and through the window in the bedroom at the raging river beyond, and I felt a little uneasy. The sun was starting to set, and the big picture windows did give the impression that someone, or something, could be watching from the woods. I got up and closed the curtains before continuing reading, just to ease my mind. October 11th, 2020, 7:45 a.m. The bed in this cabin is wonderfully comfortable. My husband slept like a rock. I, however, kept dreaming about a horned creature standing at the corner of the bedroom, staring at me. My husband said it was just a dream, but when I got up this morning, all of the curtains were opened. My husband says he didn't touch them, and I must have left them open last night. But I know I didn't. At least the noises have stopped. We plan to enjoy the hot tub and relax today. October 11th, 2020, 2:10 p.m. We spent the last hour in the hot tub. Very nice, but I kept seeing something darting among the trees. Even back inside, I feel like I'm being watched. My husband thinks I'm going crazy. Maybe I am. Yeah, I think you probably are. Maybe drink some beer and chill out. This page had started out with the same neat, tight writing of the entry before, but as the page went on, the writing became larger and more erratic, slanting across the page. The last entry on the page was the most haphazard looking. October 11th, 2020, 8 p.m. The noises are back, but now there's chanting too. My husband says it's the neighbors, but it isn't a language we know. I see glowing red lights in the woods. I'm afraid to close my eyes. My husband says I'm overreacting. I don't think I can trust him anymore. Chanting. Now I was really sure this was a joke. However, I strained my own ears in the quiet of the cabin and listened. The sun had definitely gone down now, but it was still raining. I could hear the dripping outside. Maybe if you were losing your mind, it did sound a little bit like licking. I admit that I gasped when I turned the page, even if it was all a joke. The next pages were barely legible, scribbles and symbols and nonsense. I will try to write it the best way I can for you. December 10th, 2020, 8 a.m. I'm supposed to go home this morning. I can't believe I stayed in the wads all by myself all weekend. All of this alone time mode me a little paranoid. I'm packing the book I found. It is still wet for some ryosan, like it has been in the Rowan all weekend. On second thought, I don't think I will leave. I want to stay here forever. I want to become one with Ol Gugu Yun. The bottom third of that page was just odd symbols that I had never seen before. The next and final page was simply Gugu written over and over again, covering the entire page. I rolled my eyes and closed the guest book. Very funny people. I got up and tossed it back into the basket with the other books, then rifled through them to see if there was anything good that I missed. Maybe something better than this fake monster story. Behind the travel guides was a small leather book that I hadn't noticed before. Curious, I picked it up. It was strangely wet, like it had been in the Rowan all weekend. The weird or unexplained experience you had while in the hospital. Back in August of 2020, I woke up one morning and passed out and threw up blood all over the place. I was rushed to the hospital where I then learned that I was very close to dying because I had a massive stomach ulcer and I was bleeding extremely bad. My stomach had filled up with blood while at the hospital before being rushed into emergency surgery. I was terrified. I didn't know if I was going to make it, and this woman came into my room. She looked at me and asked me, "Are you doing okay?" I said, "Yeah." She then asked me, "Are you scared?" I said, "Yes." I am not religious at all, but she asked if she could pray for me. And I was so worried about not seeing my kids again that I said, "Yes, please." I don't remember the prayer, but I remember she finished and told me everything is going to be okay and that she'd see me later. She left, and I never saw her after that again. I was in that hospital for 17 days. Then I thought about it. I realized she wasn't dressed like the nurses or any other staff. She wore all black. And it has me wondering who or what was she. I had not been given any pain medicine or anything yet, so it was not a hallucination. I've been thinking about it for 3 years now, and I need answers. I think my old bedtime story has a more sinister meaning. Every night, my dad was in charge of putting me to bed. He would help me brush my teeth and then would tuck me into my nice warm bed. Then he would tell me a story. Every night, it was the same story. The story of Bosco and Billy. I had lots of books in my room, as my mother would read to me throughout the day, but Dad would never read any of those books. He would always tell me the same story. I always assumed that either the story had come from a book, but my father had told it so many times that he didn't need to read from the book anymore, or that it was a story he was told as a child. I always enjoyed the story of Bosco and Billy. I always found that it would help me go to sleep. Usually I would be almost asleep by the end of the story. I slowly learned all of the words to the story and would sometimes recite it along with my dad. For some reason, probably because I heard it every night for years, the story stuck with me, and even to this day, I still remember all of the words to the story. The story, in its entirety, is as follows. Billy the bear was an ordinary bear with an ordinary life. But he had a small friend named Bosco who got him into strife. Most of the time, Bosco would behave, but sometimes he acted out. Billy tried to keep him in line, but sometimes he would break out. Like, one time Bosco was hungry and decided he would steal food. Billy tried to stop him and explain to Bosco that stealing is rude. But Bosco didn't listen. He stole the food anyway, and took it to his secret spot and hid it away. Bosco took the food to the large oak tree that was in the woods. There he stuffed the food inside, and that's where he hid his goods. Billy never found the stolen food. It's still hidden there to this day. Bosco wishes that it is never found, he hopes, and he prays. Billy is kind and Bosco is a little bit silly. And that is the story of Bosco and Billy. Now the story seems innocent enough, and I always thought it was a cute little story about two bears. But after recent events, I now know it is a lot more sinister than it first appears. My dad passed away a few years ago, and it took a toll on all of us, my mom especially. She began a little bit reclusive after my father passed, and so I didn't see her as often, because she shut herself off from others. I spent a long time trying to create a relationship with my mother again, and slowly, over the course of a couple of years, I did manage to reconnect with her. Things weren't as they once were, but she did invite me over once a week for a cup of coffee. During these hour-long visits, we would sit in the kitchen and talk about times gone by, about my childhood, about my time at school, and about all of the good times we had together. The one subject that didn't come up, however, was my father. I think the pain was still too raw for my mom to talk about him. On one of my weekly visits, though, I thought that I would try and mention my father, as I felt that it might do Mum some good to talk about him. I decided to mention the story that he would tell me every night. Do you remember that story Dad used to tell me before bed? The story of Billy and Bosco? I hesitantly asked, not knowing how Mum would react to the mention of her late husband. Mum looked up from her cup of coffee that she was drinking. She looked confused. Maybe because it was the first time he had been mentioned for a number of years. Or maybe because she didn't know what I was talking about. "No, I don't remember that story," she replied. "You had a lot of books, so I can't remember all of them." I was a bit surprised by this. Dad told it to me every night, so I would have thought that she would remember it. I then went on to explain that it wasn't a book. It was a story that would recite, without reading it off of a page, because he knew it so well. "I thought that your father would read you a different book each night," she said, sounding confused. "That's what he always told me anyway." I thought that this was especially strange because he never read me one of my books, and I would have thought that my own mother would have known this. "What was this story about?" she asked me. "It was about two bears, one named Billy and one named Bosco." I was about to continue explain the story when my mum suddenly interrupted me. "Did you just say the bear was named Bosco?" she asked me, sounding quite serious. "Yeah, that's right. His name was Bosco," I replied. "That's strange," Mum said. She had a look on her face that looked like she was trying to remember something. "Your father used to tell me about a friend that he used to have named Bosco," Mum continued. "He used to say that Bosco would get him in a lot of trouble when he was younger. I never met this Bosco, which your dad said was a good thing. He also said that he only met up with Bosco only once or twice after we met. And then your father told me that he was no longer going to see Bosco. He said that he finally got rid of him. I was always curious as to who he was. I have never seen any photos of him, or any evidence that he existed, now that I think about it. So, it is strange that he told you a story that contained a character with the name Bosco." Mum stopped talking for a second and I didn't know how to respond. She then looked at me and asked, "Do you remember this story? Can you tell it to me?" I recited the entire story to her. She listened to the whole tale without changing her expression. She took it all in, and then she asked, "An oak tree? Are you sure that Bosco hid the food in an old oak tree in the woods?" "Yeah, it was definitely an old oak tree. Why's that?" I asked her, sensing that something wasn't quite right. "It's just that, on mine and your father's first date, he took me to an old oak tree that was inside the Shelton Woods, only a 10-minute drive from here," she responded. "He told me then that it was lucky for me that Bosco hadn't decided to interrupt their date." She then stopped talking and stared at the wall behind where I was sitting. "I think it is time for you to go now. I'm sorry," she told me, a hint of sadness in her voice. I thought that maybe it was for the best that I did leave. I got up and gave her a small hug, which she didn't even seem to notice. Then I collected my things and headed out the front door. I got into my car and begun to drive home. On the way home, however, the thought of the old oak tree and Bosco began to fill my head. I couldn't escape these thoughts. I didn't know what it all meant, if it meant anything at all. I don't know what compelled me, but I had to visit the Shelton Woods and find this oak tree. I turned my car around and headed in the direction of the woods. 15 minutes later, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods. I took a step forward and entered them. I didn't know exactly where this oak tree was, but I was determined to find it. I explored the woods for around 10 minutes before I saw it. Standing in front of me was a huge oak tree, its branches extending high up into the sky. I walked over to the base of the tree. A sense of fear started to overcome me. Something didn't feel right. It felt like something terrible had happened here. I looked down at the ground, at the base of the tree, and I saw that the dirt there looked slightly different than the rest of the dirt in the woods. I don't know why I did this, but I bent down and begun to dig in this dirt. The police say that if I hadn't started digging, then they probably never would have found them. There were 4 bodies in total, all young women around the age of 24. All of them had been dead for over 30 years. It was undeniable. They were all murdered and buried under this tree. The DNA testing was also clear. My father was responsible for the killings. Somehow he managed to keep all of this hidden for many years. He never told anyone. The only clues that he gave were through my bedtime story, which I think was his way of confessing. The only thing I am not sure of now is, who is Bosco? Maybe my father and Bosco are the same person, or maybe he really did have a friend with that name. I don't think we will ever know. I don't think I want to know. I'm a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service. I have some stories to tell. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'd share them here. I've been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff, and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander far. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she'd never come back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name, before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because neither her mother or grandpa saw her come down. A few times I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces. Straight, sheer cliffs, with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff or miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another SAR officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we'd received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was very obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotted log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk with us back to base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking us why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of base ops, the woman turns to me, and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touches my shoulder and says, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say I was really happy when we left the area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken, regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point, we've all gotten so used to it that it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 or 40 miles, at some point we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. I have a lot more stories, and I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell some of them tomorrow. If anyone has any theories about the stairs, or if you've seen them too, let me know.